Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to this third in the panel series on social justice movements in the changed reality of the pandemic and beyond. I'm John Clarke, and I'm the Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University. Um, First of all, I want to begin by acknowledging the land that we're on. So I want to recognise that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories on which York University campuses are located that precede its establishment. We acknowledge that the area known as Te Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Let me say, an agreement that hasn't entirely been lived up to on one side. Also, because we are not gathered in the same space that York's land acknowledgement is based on, we ask that you may not be. We may not represent the territory that you're currently on. So we ask that you each take responsibility to acknowledge the traditional land that you're on, and that we remind ourselves of our responsibility to care for the land, all living things on it, and our relationships with them. This series is co-hosted by the Global Labour Research Centre and the Department of Politics at York University. It's held in honour of the memory of Leo Panitch. Leo was an enormously important figure at York University for many years and in other academic settings, but he was also on the political left, a towering and enormously important figure on an international scale. He died tragically in December of last year. He was absolutely central to the formation of the Packer Initiative. And I would like to say, as someone who came from outside of an academic setting, from an anti-poverty organisation, and became involved here at York University, he was incredibly supportive in assisting me. So, to the memory of Leo Panitch, we dedicate this panel series. Just on the tech side, a couple of things. There'll be live captioning. The chat box will not be open to all people participating. There will be a question and answer. There is a question and answer section that enables you to put written questions in, and we'll be dealing with those during the course of the panel. We are going to begin then this panel discussion of the threat of facing the threat of mass evictions. We're going to address it from the standpoint of tenants struggling to defend their housing. We're going to address it from the standpoint of homeless people under attack, and we're going to address it from the standpoint of the Jane Finch community close to York University. Each presentation will be of up to 20 minutes. In the case of two of the presentations, two people will be sharing the presentation. At the end, there'll be the opportunity to put questions to the panel members. You can do that individually to one panel member, or you can put out a general question. One thing I would ask is that as people are speaking, that is the time to get your question in, so that we avoid a situation where there aren't a lot of questions ready to go at the end of the presentation. So be early in terms of getting in your written questions. So first, to deal with the question of homeless encampments and the attack on homeless people in the midst of the pandemic, we have two people who will be making presentations. Greg Cook, who is on the steering committee of the Shelter and Housing Justice Network and has been a drop-in and outreach worker for the past 12 years. Also, Simone Schmidt, who organises with the Encampment Support Network and has been active in racial justice, anti-poverty, Indigenous sovereignty solidarity issues and struggles for the past 20 years. So welcome to those two speakers.
Thanks, John. It's an honor to speak to each of you today. So I'm going to start in the early 1990s under the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien. Canada terminated its social housing supply program. In 1995, the Progressive Conservative government of Mike Harris and his Common Sense Revolution stopped development of 17,000 units of nonprofit and co-op housing, slashed welfare and disability pension rates by 21.6%, and in the process threw tens of thousands of people into crisis. Welfare offices installed plexiglass barriers and prioritized organizational efficiency over the lives of marginalized and racialized people across the province. In Toronto, shelters overflowed, hundreds were relegated to sleeping on the street, and many more were forced to panhandle, collect empties, and squeegee windshields in an effort to afford food and other necessities. In response, the Toronto government enacted Safe Streets Act in 1999, made zoning and funding decisions that accelerated gentrification, and adopted a housing first policy suite. Under the apparently progressive mayoralty of David Miller, as Don Mitchell articulates in Mean Streets, housing first policies around the country are less rooted in the right to housing than they are in the cost benefit of analysis of how best to keep the homeless off the streets and out of visibility. As part of this policy suite, the city created Streets to Homes, Parks Ambassadors, and would only fund outreach agencies that did not give out survival supplies. In an effort to legitimize its neoliberal agenda of uploading wealth to developers in Bay Street, the city decided to double down on problematizing poor and racialized communities. If you couldn't afford rent, it was your fault. The town would be engineered for the elite at all costs. I remember doing outreach under the Gardiner Expressway in 2005. One week we'd be checking in with people at an encampment. The next, all we'd see were hoof prints of police horses in the dirt. As more condo towers went up in the adjacent City Place development, the more the city insisted that unhoused people nearby be made invisible. Fast forward to 2014, and city stats acknowledged that 110 encampments were cleared. About 140 in 2015, 204 in 2016, about 315 in 2017, 413 in 2018, and over 700 in 2019. As part of the Shelter and Housing Justice Network in 2019, I started having conversations with frontline workers who are part of OCAP, as well as longtime advocates like Barrick German and Kathy Crow, on how to stop the displacement of people we knew. We knew that there were more and more encampments each year, that the city was clearing them, and that it made it more difficult for people to survive. It affected health, both physical and psychological. In December of 2019, we were tipped off that the Parks Ambassadors, city-funded outreach workers, and police would clear Rosedale Valley on January 7. A group from OCAP and a group from SHJN met to figure out what we should do. First, we checked with people living in the Rosedale Valley to find out what they wanted. Then we wrote a public letter to the mayor demanding that he not clear the encampments. We then held a press conference on January 6th in the Rosedale Valley, demanding that the city not clear the encampment. In the end, the city doubled down and sent Brad Ross, who is the public relations spokesperson for the city, to orchestrate the clearing of the encampments for the TV cameras. 2 months later, the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. We started demanding one hotel room for each person in the shelter system, and that people on social assistance get a top up. At work, we scrambled to learn about PPE and IPAC cleaning protocols. Frontline networking calls filled our days as we tried to figure out how to fill gaps, compared COVID protocols, and dug in to find out how many agencies and resources had shut down. The network of harm reduction workers had extensive connections across the city and tons of relevant skills. Encampments started showing up in parks. In George Hislop Park, which is next to Sanctuary, and on our property, there were 40 tents. Many of the residents were regular members of our community. The city decided to clear them and move everyone into the Broadway apartments. The Parks Ambassadors were there for the clearing and were tearing down tents even before residents got on the bus. They didn't have room to give everyone an apartment. And so that same day, Troy Ford put a notice of an eviction in the park. In response, I put out a call to all the harm reduction workers in my email, as well as some OCAP members. About 15 people showed up alongside Sanctuary staff to defend the remaining tents and residents. The city backed down and drove off. A couple of weeks later, I heard from an outreach worker I knew that there was eviction notices under the Gardiner Expressway. We quickly checked in with residents to find out what they wanted. Some wanted defense, others wanted observation. So I put another call out. I'm going to hand over to Simone to keep going.
So I have to tell you that I just got a text that there is an eviction currently happening at Clarence Square, which is in the downtown core. And this is like a regular thing that happens in terms of our like just having to be on constant response. So I am a bit distracted, but I'm going to keep going from where Greg left off, which is that I met Greg in mid-May and I met him under the gardener. I'm a musician and a dishwasher. And so I've been out of work for the pandemic. Really, I'm on CRB. And in May, I got word from a harm reduction worker friend that there are people living in encampments under the Gardner Expressway along the waterfront, and they were being evicted. So I called my friend Jeff Burke, who's an artist and a camera retail sales worker, and my friend Ginger Dean, who's a gardener, and we're all out of work. And we met up with about 20 other people who we didn't really know. And what I saw was city housing workers from Streets to Homes who were backed by parks ambassadors, police, bylaw officials, and other city workers. And basically, there were these bulldozers and dump trucks and people were being forced to relocate. When I introduced myself to the other people on hand who were there for eviction defense, I realized that they were mostly harm reduction workers and outreach workers who were on their time off. And, you know, the total upheaval of the systems and community in which they worked compelled them to try to enact some harm reduction under the gardener. So, you know, some real form of solidarity. But me and Jeff and Ginger were all struck by the brutality of the city's practices because we're not immune to them. And we started to organize our peers. We learned really quickly from more experienced people like Greg and Zoe and Doug of Sanctuary, how the city was posting notices at sites, giving people 72 hours to move out or be evicted. And because all the musicians I know were complaining about being at home, I figured like I could get them outside. So I put out a Facebook call and so many people came down to support. And from there, we organized this thing called rapid response, which is like a way to mobilize a critical mass of people to attend evictions. At the least, we can observe and mitigate the harm caused at an eviction. And at the most, we can stop it. So I'm going to tell you about one eviction that happened at Little Norway Park. That's a small plot of land on the lakeshore right across from Billy Bishop Airport. Under the tall pines in the heat of the summer, it's a relatively nice place to wake up. And it's also a park at the foot of a bunch of condos where people want to walk their dogs. And so there were about 25 people living there in 16 tents, and the city had posted an eviction notice. And so we decided to ask residents if they wanted our support. And many of them did. And so what the eviction looked like that day was actually quite different than the one under the gardener. There were no cops who came initially. Instead, Streets to Homes, who are city housing workers, went around and told people they had an option to move to a newly opened shelter hotel. And they had a 2-bag limit for what they could take with them. And then the rest of their stuff would be trashed. They would be transported in a chartered TTC bus to a shelter hotel at 401 and Kennedy within the next 2 hours. And the housing workers didn't have brochures outlining the conditions or rules or locations of the shelter hotels. And so when we asked them to provide, you know, a welcome package or something to inform people about where they were moving to, it took about 45 minutes to just get basic information about where people were being asked to move to. And so in effect, we're just watching them tell people to make an uninformed decision really quickly to leave their community for a place that is an hour and a half away by transit. So that day, most people took the offers from the city to move, and a few people held out till the end of day and wanted to stay in the park. But when faced with the clearing of the rest of the camp and the reality that the police would be by after Streets to Homes, those people who wanted to stay packed up and moved to another location not too far away. And throughout the week, as we returned to that neighborhood every day, we realized that 11 of the 25 people who had been moved to shelter hotels had returned to the neighborhood, but simply moved their camps to scattered places around the area. Those places that they moved to were largely left unvisited by Streets to Homes because they weren't in prime dog walking green space real estate. That land is not considered assets by condo owners, so it's where people can live. I'm telling you about the Little Norway Park eviction because the experience taught us 4 things that we carry with us in our work in the Encampment Support Network. The first is that shelter hotels are not working for people. So people should have been able to try out the option being offered to them and then return to their stuff if it didn't work out. But the threat of the police moving in to clear after like they move necessarily undercut their right to self-determine and make their own choices. The second thing we learned is that if we were going to assist people in self-determining, making their own decisions, we would have to be forging real relationships with people and becoming literate in the city's options and offers. The third thing was that the city would try to use us to do their job. So for instance, one of the city workers with parks gave us plastic gloves to clean up people's belongings after they were coerced into taking offers. And so we always risk being co-opted and being part of the soft coercion of people into situations that they don't want or need. And the fourth thing we learn is that, like every other battle within the settler state, this is a fight about land and who gets to live on it. Indigenous and Black people are overrepresented among unhoused people and are being forcibly displaced by the soft arm of social work. And so through attending evictions, we noticed that there was this deep need to provide encampment residents with the basic humanitarian aid that the city refuses them. As Greg said, since David Miller adopted the Housing First policy in 2005, no one is allowed to hand out survival gear. So city agencies can't do that. And so we formed the Encampment Support Network. It's a network of 6 neighborhood committees comprised of drivers and outreach volunteers that deliver survival gear like water, tents, first aid kits, sleeping bags, snacks, Gatorade, ice to encampments across the city daily. And we coordinate hot meals and clothing drives, and we take direction from encampment residents. Basically, we ask, what do you need? And then we try to provide it. So that means we advocate for access to city facilities like showers and washrooms. And sometimes we throw community feasts, or we get an ice cream truck, or we organize speak outs with encampment residents. Wow, I'm behind on my pictures, but yeah, we do a lot of different stuff. We have like a sign committee, and they paint signs with messages requested by encampment residents to hang on their tents. And we work with the Community Justice Collective to try to provide information about people's rights or respond to police brutality at raids and things like this. Every encampment and its community is different depending on its geography, proximity to services, and most importantly, the people living in them. Lamport Stadium encampment, for example, is right next to a respite. So it attracts people who are used to accessing services. But Cherry Beach is much more remote, and many people living there do not want to access the system. The longer we've done this, the clearer it is that we are the only people other than residents on the ground daily in encampments. And so we have a responsibility to speak to the situation, because many people, academics, journalists, city PR machines, streets to homes workers, try to say things about this reality. And I'll be pointed and say, because I'm speaking to university, like, I'm deeply troubled by how academics don't take it upon themselves to speak directly to encampment residents, but instead try to use ESN as proxies. Go talk to people if you're going to make your money speaking about them. The city never talks to people and wants ESN to collude with them. They want us to work with Streets to Homes, and we've refused. People can speak for themselves and make their own decisions, and that's what should be facilitated at every turn. We make daily reports about city presence and encampments based on what residents tell us and what we see, and based on these facts, we fact check the narratives that the city PR has been putting out. For instance, if you write to your city councilor about encampments, they will tell you Streets to Homes workers are on the ground 24/7, connecting with encampment residents to get them into safer indoor space. First of all, we know that they aren't connecting with encampment residents daily. Streets to Homes has put people on lists for shelter and then not returned for 6 weeks at a time, or even tried to contact them again. Secondly, there is no safer indoor space. We know this because we see people come back all the time. The city engages in an ongoing campaign to make life so difficult for people in encampments in order to clear land on which people are living and restore it to its position as an asset for private real estate investors, but still people feel safer living in encampments than shelter hotels. ESN has a bunch of committees. Donations committee solicits donations. It's a majority white, it's comprised of majority white housed people in Toronto with proximity to wealth. So we leverage that. Many people are gig workers and artists. And so we employ the same tools that we've all had to learn in order to operate in this economy. Namely, we use social media and long work days for which we aren't compensated. We have a media committee, a podcast, a community care collective, explainers committee. They discuss policy and try to educate. And we try to do broader education around what we're seeing in encampments. We think it's important that people directly involved in outreach sit on all these committees. I'm grateful for mentors we have who are older housing advocates. They do community education, or they show up when people, have a critical incident. So something that we didn't know was going to happen when we started ESN is like, sometimes we come upon someone who's died in a tent. And so then our volunteers are, negotiating what to do, what do you do when that happens? What's really cool is that over the past year, more and more encampment residents are joining ESN. The winter has been hard in terms of like a sustained presence because you're just fighting the elements. It's this constant survival. But someone like Derek Black, who held out for housing for 11 months, has joined ESN, which is awesome. He's like really, really active and so cool. And this means that invariably ESN is going to be changing. We have like a structure, but it's like flexible. And we have some principles of unity that are like not going to change at all. So we center the voices of encampment residents in our messaging. We're an abolitionist network. We won't be paid off. And we are working toward understanding what a truly decolonial approach to the housing crisis is. I keep saying we're not an agency because we're not one and we don't act like one, but largely we are treated like one by actual agencies who expect us to triage encampment residents or tell them how to do things. For instance, this summer, we were trying to get like health workers into encampments, like nurses and doctors, and the Inner City Health Administration, who gets provincial funding to serve unhoused people, took 14 weeks to do that. They like went to meetings with us all the time, and they seem more concerned with securing funding for their contracts in shelter hotels than responding to the needs of people on the ground who had wounds like I've never seen, because they didn't have access to sanitation. And that total lack of urgency from the agency sector has meant that I watch people die. And I say this because as someone new to this situation, I'm endlessly disgusted by the refusal of agency workers to speak up about what they're seeing in shelter hotels and in encampments. And it means like we always have to, encampment support network has to. And I guess I'm going to toss it back over to Greg to talk more about that.
Thanks, Simone. For years, myself, SHJN, and members of OCAP have been working hard to mobilize other frontline workers. At one point, we had a group called FLAN, Frontline Action Network, but nothing seemed to stick. What was it that made it so difficult to enable people to speak up about the suffering and death we witness each day? Is it organizational structure? Is it the organizational structure of agencies, the funding models, or the reticence of agencies to be critical of the government that also pays their bills? During COVID, this has been especially apparent. After all, dozens of workers, union members have tested positive for COVID, and working conditions have been abysmal. Again and again, we have asked unions to speak up, to fight for their workers. We have asked them to show class solidarity for people who aren't housed. There has been an overwhelming silence. Why is this? As Ruth Wilson Gilmore succinctly answers some of these questions when she talks about the nonprofit industrial complex, she states, they have had to conform to public rules governing public money and have found that being fiduciary agents in some ways trumps their principal desire to comfort and assist those abandoned to their care. They do not want to lose the contracts to provide services they truly care about, clients who otherwise would have nowhere to go. Thus, they've been sucked into the world of nonprofit providers, which, like all worlds, has its own jargon, limits, determined by bid and budget cycles and legislative trends, and both formal as well as informal hierarchies. And generally the issues they are paid to address have been narrowed to program-specific categories and remedies, which make staff, who often have great understanding of the scale and scope of both individual clients and the needs of society at large, become in their everyday practices technocrats through imposed specialization. The shadow state, then, is real, but without a significant political clout, forbidden by law to advocate for systemic change, and bound by public rules and nonprofit charters to stick to its mission to get out of business or suffer legal consequences if it strays along the way. We'd like to leave you with two questions that we have from this past year. In the past 12 months, as we've tried to fight back and speak out, we've both asked for material and political support from unions. We've also recognized that we're often fighting against unionized employees, shelter workers, city workers, police. My experience of trying to mobilize frontline workers for years, even to get them to speak up, with limited success. In the meantime, hundreds of gig workers and non-unionized workers have spent thousands of hours caring for and fighting for the safety of people who are unhoused. Begs the question, what good are the unions?
My question is, what does it mean to decommodify housing within the settler state? Actually, I think of this while appealing to the colonial government to build housing. What does it mean to fight and engage a government that at its historical foundations is colonial and capitalist? And what can we actually expect from institutions and administrations whose very existences are predicated on displacing Indigenous communities from their land and ensuring that tens of thousands of racialized and poor communities are unhoused? I think of this all the time. Thanks so much for giving me time to speak.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. Next, we have a presentation from Jane Finch, which I think is always particularly important to hear from the Jane Finch community when an event is being held that speaks to questions of social struggles and social justice at York University, because it's right on the doorstep. And that's an enormously significant question, I think, that people need to consider. So we have two people who will be speaking on the question of the epidemic before the pandemic, the Jane Finch housing crisis. We have Butterfly Gopal, who is, I know, a very active member of the Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. Is a community health worker at Black Creek Community Health Centre. And we also have Anna K. Brown, who is co-chair of the Jane Finch Education Action Group and is with the Jane Finch Housing Coalition. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not a pro at sharing screens, so everything's okay. People see stuff. Okay. All right. Thanks so much to the organizers for this event, putting it on super timely, as well as sharing the presentation stage with the amazing work that's happening with folks across the city. I think it was really important, the background that Greg shared in terms of, you know, the federal regime at the time, and then Mike Harris. It really does put things into context. And just hearing the first presentation, just thinking about, you know, we're here to present on housing, but, you know, talking about mental health and wellness and you know, primary health care, workers and workers' rights, the roles of unions. So it's not just a one-dimensional issue, it's super layered. And I really appreciate the first presentation. So thanks so much, folks. So yeah, I'm Butterfly. We're going to be presenting on Jane Finch Housing Coalition. The epidemic before the pandemic, really to put the context is so important for us to take on what's happening now and whatever post-pandemic is going to look like. I'm going to just ask Anna K. to introduce herself, and then I'll get right into it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna K. Brown, and I also is a housing organizer. Sorry, I work alongside Butterfly and our team. Thank you so much.
So the Jane Finch Housing Coalition is a product of really a lot of work that's been happening on the ground. It was created out of a Jane and Finch response to the city of Toronto when they rolled out with their Toronto Strong Neighborhood strategy. And forgive me, there's alarm testing happening, so we'll be hearing that every once in a while. And the city of Toronto rolled out with this, really robust strategy with all these resources put into it, but really didn't consult with our community. So Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty pushed the city of Toronto, and we hosted our own consultation in the neighborhood. As well as a number of community consultations, focus groups to talk about the city of Toronto's Toronto Strong Neighborhoods. And the city named one of these domains as physical surroundings. And when Jane and Finch got a hold of this discussion around physical surroundings, it really looked like housing. It looked like TTC development and new development. It looked like police brutality. So we really unpacked what physical surroundings look like. And out of that work, Jane and Finch Housing Coalition was created, Jane and Finch Education Action Group that Anna Kay is co-chair of, as well as Jane and Finch Economic Opportunities, Jane and Finch Healthcare Action Table, and Black Creek Food Justice Network was doing work since 2014 in the neighborhood. But we also heard from those consultations, food insecurity as being a really huge issue. So Jane and Finch Housing Coalition started its work. Our current membership is Grow Our Grassway, and that's the community of Fir Grove, who's under massive gentrification right now and huge displacement. And that work really started with residents pushing back on housing and really getting resident engagement and push and direction of what the process is going to look like for residents, as well as really starting to strike a conversation very locally around community benefit frameworks. Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty, the Tamil Freedom Coalition, which is a specific cultural group for the Tamil community. But what we saw was during the pandemic, folks are living in the building and we're living together. So the work did broaden during the pandemic. Black Creek Community Health Center, Jane and Finch Center, Social Planning Toronto, and Toronto Community Benefit Framework. And we're a grassroots coalition of resident service providers and community organizations working towards housing justice in the Jane and Finch community.
Sorry, Butterfly.
Sure.
We're not seeing your screen.
Oh, you're not?
No, I'm sorry. I was just trying to find a perfect time just to let you know. We're not seeing it.
Oh, that's a perfect time. Okay.
Yes. So I know you're going to get into the maps and stuff. So I just wanted to catch you before.
Sure. Just bear with me. Can you all see it now?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Thanks so much.
No worries. That's why we're a team.
So just to look at our local demographic, Jane and Finch is a melting pot of the world. Our neighborhood is made up of 150 different nationalities. We speak over 60 different languages and dialects. You can walk in the neighborhood anytime and hear all kinds of music from Afro beats to soca. You can smell food. We're a loving neighborhood. We know each other. We have each other's backs. Our neighborhood also, like I said, scored the lowest from the city of Toronto, and really just band-aid solutions of barbecues, but really not addressing the systemic issues. Our neighborhood is made up of single-parent homes, a huge population of youth and seniors, complex health issues. Our neighborhood is under attack in so many ways. Greg spoke to some of the earlier policies that really ramped up gentrification and development in our neighborhoods. So we also have, it's an old community. It was a community that was built in response of moving racialized poor people from the downtown social housing communities of Regent Park, and develop these communities very rapidly to move racialized poor people from the downtown core. Our workers, you know, a few years ago, we did a temp agency report, a JFAP, and at that time there was over 200 temp agencies in the immediate area. And again, this is kind of the rollout with some of these policies where Ontario really did um, uh, capitalize on temp agency and that policy to really roll that out in the province. And we see temp agencies really exist in racialized poor neighborhoods alongside with, you know, the money marts and the money marts. So the type of housing we have, so we have, you know, high-rise buildings. I'm sure folks know Jane and Finch and think of the high-rise buildings in our neighborhood. These high-rise buildings are really horrible, horrible landlords. Like Metcalf and Greenwin. We have also low-rise buildings, rental units in homes. Toronto community housing, we have a high concentration of Toronto community housing of buildings as well as townhomes. We have homeowners, housing co-ops, and homelessness, I think, has shifted over the years. We're a community that cares for one another. So what homeless looked like maybe 10 years ago was more inside our homes, couch surfing, moving from one place to the other, you know, multiple families coming together to rent, to afford homes. And what we've been seeing more recently is homelessness existing in very open spaces now, in plazas, in the backs of malls and plazas. You would see it in the staircase, but now you really see people are holding space in staircases. And you're also seeing panhandling, and these things are more obvious in the last 7 years than it has been in the past. Our housing, because of the culture and our landlords, it's been historic with, you know, unsafe homes, poor maintenance and repairs. You know, the rooming houses are built in ways where, you know, they're splitting up small spaces to make more room. So they're not safe. Fire code regulations don't exist. And also in terms of our shelters, we see shelters popping up with the Plaza Hotel. When folks from Syria, refugees had come into the community, that was one of the shelters that opened up in the neighborhood that was very close to our neighborhood. And then shortly after the Gosford fire, moving people around from York University, Driftwood Community Center, there's a hotel on Steeles that I believe is now a shelter with the City of Toronto. So I point to this in terms of these emergency housing responses. Folks in our neighborhood would typically have to leave the immediate area, the community that they know and feel safe in, that their children are connected to leave the neighborhood, to find emergency housing, but still come back to the neighborhood for school and work and so on. So I spoke to it in terms of Regent Park and the response. It was a rapid development that wasn't thought through fully. It was poorly designed from the jump. You know, when you put in a social housing and these high-rise buildings and not thinking about the socio and economic responses, there's huge impacts. The neighborhood, when folks were displaced and put here, what you see is relationships with the police have been historic in this community. Black and racialized bodies being policed and criminalized, and we see this in a documentary, Home Feeling, done in 1983 with the National Film Board. Please check out the film, and that just speaks to the history of not only with police and police and community, but also the types of resources that come into this neighborhood. It wasn't into programs and services until community residents organized, and then you see a small organization pop up, Jane and Finch Center. And with this urban planning, you know, when you're downtown, you can walk around downtown, you can do shopping, you can go to a fresh food market, you can take a seat. Our neighborhood isn't a walkable neighborhood. And we did a lot of work in this, you know, 10 years ago when we hosted Jane's Walks in the neighborhood to really demonstrate how unwalkable our neighborhood is, and the things that we need to make it more walkable, to increase health, interaction, to access different community services and programs. And this is the work that the neighborhood has been doing and pushing. Our community is also built around beautiful creeks and green space. And if you live in the neighborhood, that's part of how we move around the neighborhood. Those are our shortcuts, there are walkthroughs. There are beautiful spaces to bike ride. But again, you know, the services that you see very in your face is policing. So these these spaces are also policed in very different ways. And we also see the new subways popping up in 2018, which was really great. You know, the neighborhood wanted better transit, but these transit system, these subways are located in a way where if you don't want to cut through Jane and Finch, it's set up in a way where you go right to York, right to the 905 area, and right to downtown. And the LRT that's coming in, yeah, so I see off my balcony every day. It's a madhouse on Finch. But again, these are ways of, you know, increasing the property value of our neighborhood, and a way that our great landlords are increasing their rent and pushing out community residents that have built the identity of this neighborhood. This slide is from the Three Cities report, and it looks at racialized poverty. Whoops, sorry, folks. And you can see in the 1970s, you can see, I hope folks can make out this map. If you're looking at it, the left side where you see a lot of yellow, that's kind of where Jane and Finch is. And the red is levels of poverty, okay? And you see that more in the downtown, and that was in the 70s. So our community, the Jane and Finch community, was a strong middle class, working class community. And over the years, you can see divestments in this neighborhood, jobs, lack of investments in jobs and economic opportunities aren't happening in the neighborhood. At the same time, you're seeing temp agencies as the way to live and to make a living is only through temp agencies. And you see, you know, in the 80s, 10 years later, how it's starting to shift. And where you see that blue line, like that blue cluster, that's also where that subway line is. In 1995 now, Greg points to Mike Harris. That was also a difficult time for me. I just had my first son. And I was on OW. and I was living in precarious housing, and we had to go into a shelter. And this was a huge hit for communities like Jane and Finch, racialized working poor neighborhoods that were built in response to moving racialized poverty from downtown. So in the West, Northwest, and the Northeast, and you know, and so on. This is intentional, it's structural, it's systemic. It didn't just fall out of the sky. Tons of research, reports, millions and millions of dollars that were used to commission to do these reports, with great recommendations and actions and dollars that need to be invested in these actions. And here we are, sadly, in a pandemic with more cuts coming. So with this slide, oops, sorry. There's so many windows open that I can't leave you guys. So so with this one, this is the poverty and eviction filing rate, and this is in 2016, right, Anna Kay? I'm being blocked by years. Oh yeah, 2016. Yes. And again, where we saw that big chunk of red in the Jane and Finch area, this is what you're seeing for the eviction rates. This is in 2016. We've been hearing about this for many years, a decade or more, of knowing that people are struggling to maintain and find affordable housing. And NLK will speak more when we talk about affordable housing and developments. But these are blatant indicators that is, you know, before the pandemic, of inequities around housing and who's getting housing, the cost of living, what, you know, folks' income, folks on ODSP and OW, folks who are working through temp agencies or precarious work, working 3-4 jobs to make ends meet. This is the result. And we see, in particular, Black households and evictions in 2016. And again, a concentration in this neighborhood, the Northwest.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pass it on to Anna Kay. Thanks so much, folks.
Hello, everyone.
So Anna Kay, before you begin, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to say that the time has got a bit tight, and I'm going to have to ask you to just be as brief as you can, because we're just running out of time here.
No problem. I realize that. Okay. So I'll just make it very quick. I think Butterfly and Craig and Simone touched on some very important things. When we think about evictions and who are being displaced, we need to think about the communities and the people who live in those communities that are displaced. When we think about Regent Park, around developments, Lawrence Heights, Golden Miles, Mount Dennis, all of those places, what do they have in common? Eglinton and Oakwood Strip, all of those things have high racialized people who have built these communities, who have used a very little resources and funding and built those communities into communities that you want to live in and where you would want to live in and raise your family. And when we think about the correlation of eviction, we should also keep in mind that poor planning, systematic barriers, the lack of resources and funding, problematic policies around affordability, the lack of rent control, precarious work, affordable transportation and car insurance, and the lack of affordable food and childcare plays very important roles in how where people live and how they're able to continue living in those communities. And when we're looking at things like even Bill 184 that the provincial government came out with, and how that now further takes away tenants' rights around how they're able to negotiate with their landlords, has very negative impact on them. Butterfly, can go to the next slide. I know this for time. When we're looking at even just scheduled eviction hearings during the COVID-19, here we are in our cluster where you're seeing high concentration of hearings that are still happening within our community. Even though there might be a moratorium right now, we know that once that is lifted, these people are now going to be evicted out of their home when it's possible. And we're still dealing with high displacements. Where are these people going to be able to go? We can't say to the shelters because they're already overcrowded. And when you have families, and most time there's generational of family members living together, that means grandparents, aunt, uncles, and brothers and sisters and their children living together, then we're evicting mass amount of people. Butterfly, just to the next slide. And when we're thinking about even new developments that are happening in our community, for instance, this condo here, this is one of the examples of how when we're building, the city's not building for the people who are living in the community now, they're building for who they want in the community. So when you're building condos that are only offering majority of 1-bedrooms, and we know that this is a community is built up of families, 3, 4, 5 people living together, this is just terrible. Toronto housing, the next plan over here is the revitalization. And when we look at that also, it is around how they evicted people to be able to start the process of revitalization and the displacement of folks from their homes, we're placing them in places that they have no connections to, right? So people have invested greatly into these communities, and the city now find values in those communities and how that has such a negative impact. But my last point is, I want to just say that collectively, we all have a part, just as all of our politicians have a part. Our anchor institutions and organizations that have profited off of being in these community have a role to play. That includes all of our local BIAs and including York University, that is an anchor institution here, that is around local hiring, social procurement, making sure that local businesses are getting some of these contracts and can be able to offer some of the services, and hiring local people to be able to keep some of those dollars in communities like Jane and Finch. I'm going to end it right there. Butterfly can quickly go down to, we're doing some of our workshops, and we would love to see our first workshop will be on May 18th around Bill 184. So I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you so much. And Butterfly, just go to the last page of us, how they can be able to be in contact with us. Thank you so much. And thank you, John, for the extra 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And finally, a presentation on the eviction crisis and the resistance to it. Sam Nithyananthan from People's Defence.
Give me just one quick moment here so I can share my screen. Folks see that, correct?
Yep, yep.
There we go. So just a quick introduction for those who don't know People's Defenses. We're an organization working to build real power for racialized immigrant working class peoples in the city of Toronto. We do this, neighborhood by and communities across the GTA. And how we do this is person by person, building by building, block by block. We work in tandem with tenants and community members. And our goal here is to take on the exploiters and the oppressors of the city's working class. And there's two reasons that this plays itself out. We do this in order to defend our common interest, first and foremost. But we also do this to transform our conditions. And so that's what People's Defense PD is about. But let's jump into what we're supposed to be talking about, the COVID eviction crisis. I think as many people would have seen in the news over the last few months, there's a mass eviction crisis that's playing out across the city. And I think the comrades have highlighted what it would kind of look like beforehand. But just to even, sorry, give me a second here. Just to even jump into that a bit. What we saw in the neighborhoods that we organized in right when COVID was happening and prior to, was a precarious existence of the city's working class. People were paycheck to paycheck, struggling with their biggest expense, that was rent. And these communities have been always underfunded and over-policed. What we've been seeing in the city of Toronto, as both the ESN comrades and JFAB have pointed out, is a shift over the last few decades. the city has become effectively the playground for the rich, and working class people have been being pushed out. What I want to highlight with this map, this was done in August of 2020, and it was done by the Toronto Star. On the right-hand side is in red is where you see COVID rates. And as you saw with the maps from JFAP, you know, the left, sorry, the east and west end of the city, and then the northwest and east end especially, are where we see our working class communities, racialized communities, immigrant communities. And COVID has torn those communities apart. One of the neighborhoods that we work out of, Crescent Town, you know, these are high rises of 29 stories high, 25 across, and they've been tinder boxes for COVID. And those were the rates from August of 2020. But the purple is also interesting. The purple is the rates of evictions filed in 2016. And this has been playing itself out for decades. This is just a glimpse of it. And what the Toronto Star was trying to point out is it going to be that the same neighborhoods that have been affected by COVID, are they the same ones that are going to be affected by evictions? And what we saw over the past few months especially is that is the case. How do you make a playground for the rich? You have to push people out, which leads to the eviction crisis. As we've seen over the last few months from articles and the work that tenants and tenant organizers have been doing, there's been thousands of evictions facilitated by the Landlord-Tenant Board, the LTB. This has always existed. Since the LTB's creation in the early 2000s, it has been a pro-landlord entity, helping to facilitate the push out of working class and poor people. But what we saw was a heightened form of this over the past few months. The LTB, what we've seen with it is landlords being able to drag people in front of this quasi-judicial body, court, for no fault of their own, because they couldn't afford rent because of the massive job loss that came out of the COVID crisis, a pandemic that we had no control over, and that it was not our fault. But it's I can throw the stats and all that, but just to actually give you a glimpse of what this looks like, and hopefully that this audio works alongside of this.
Sam, sorry to interrupt you, but we can only see half your screen sometimes.
Oh, Ms. Glickman, do you know why she's not here?
Yeah. We're trying to work on it, I think.
Sorry, are we seeing just my notes on the side here?
Yeah.
That's probably what it is.
Give me a second here. Let me unshare this and share it again. Is that better?
That looks like it to me.
Perfect. Yeah, he's in. So let me play this video from an adjudicator, Dale Whitmore, from the Landlord-Tenant Board. Dale was nice enough to the starting of this pandemic, call this the eviction process, an eviction blitz that's happening at the LTB, and you'll see what that looks like.
Is the tenant present? Oh, Ms. Glickman, do you know why she's not here?
I'm not aware why she's not here.
Okay, I have your update sheet. What are you seeking?
I'm seeking a standard order.
And has the landlord attempted to negotiate a payment plan?
We have.
I will issue a standard order.
Thank you.
Next is 2 TNL. Tenant is the tenant present? And Ms. Glickman, do you know why they're not here?
No, I'm not aware.
Have your update sheet. What are you seeking?
A standard order, please.
And has the landlord attempted to negotiate a payment plan?
Yes, we have.
I will issue standard order. And TSO. Tenant is the tenant present? Do you know why they're not here?
I'm not aware.
And what are you seeking?
A standard order, please.
Has the landlord attempted to negotiate a payment plan?
Yes.
And I will issue standard order.
Thank you.
For thousands of working class, poor, racialized immigrant tenants in the city, and the city of Toronto has 47% of the city of Toronto are renters. This is what the last few months have been looking like. A fast track eviction factory on hyperdrive, on steroids, pushing people out. And the comrades had mentioned Bill 184, and I think it's important to touch on that. What Dale Whitmore here was asking Ilana Glickman, who's the paralegal for Randy Management, one of the buildings that we work out of, and also right outside of York University, Fountainhead. Randy Management owns 4 different properties, one of the highest eviction rates that we've been seeing in the city. But what we've been seeing with this Bill 184 situation, facilitated by the Ford government, is that landlords are expected to negotiate with their tenants. And if they do, and if they say they do, this eviction process is fast tracked for them. But a negotiation under this Bill 184 plan is, as long as they have a conversation, however coerced or not that is, and they sign a repayment plan, it is associated with this thing called Section 78. Landlords do not have to go back to the landlord-tenant board to evict a tenant. If within these repayment plans, if tenants are a day late or $1 short, they can be evicted out. No court system, none of that stuff. And right now, what we've been seeing, there's estimates of 400,000 people across the city of Toronto who have been in arrears, the majority of which have signed repayment plans. This is what the mass eviction crisis looks like. It's not simply at the courts. It's about what's to happen shortly, when those people, for no fault of their own, fall back on their rent. But this is not about how someone is going to get evicted. This is about housing in the city. So I think we have to start with asking ourselves, how did we get here? The pictures on the right there, these are directly from the neighborhoods of Crescenttown and Goodwood. These are what people live in on a day-to-day basis. Bed bugs on children's cribs, bed bug bites, those cockroaches that you see there. And on the left, these are some of the largest housing providers in the city of Toronto. There's a misconception that exists with housing that the landlord lobby loves to put out, that somehow housing is provided by mom and pop, a widowed older woman who is renting out her basement. The reality in that situation is that's only 3 to 5% of the housing stock in the city. What really is happening is that housing is run by corporate slumlords. Housing has become a commodity over the last few decades that is bought and sold, that is consolidated, and they know that they can do it. They own this commodity that people need because we have no other choice. And we're willing to pay whatever to exist in the city. Today, 9 out of 10 landlords, 9 out of 10 largest providers of housing in the city are corporate landlords. The 10th one, of course, being Toronto Community Housing, the city of Toronto. And what they've been doing over the last few decades, as the ESN comrades have pointed out, from the 1970s onwards, and especially under Mike Harris, where the downloading of this responsibility has kept on going down to the municipal level and then the privatization. What they've been doing is monopolizing on housing. There has been effectively a monopoly created by these corporate entities in order to have a consolidated power. For example, Starlight, which is one of the largest landlords, not only in the city of Toronto, but across the country, just in 2019 bought $1.7 billion worth of housing stock. The company is bought and sold on the stock exchange and is one of the largest housing providers, both now in Canada, but moving into the United States. And because they can control this, because that they can push this need that people have, and they consolidate and monopolize on it, they have huge amounts of return. Capriet, which is a real estate investment trust. These are one of those things where multiple investors come together, put their money together, and then buy out as much property as they possibly can. Capriet has recorded 65% revenue over the last few years. To put that into to context, to qualify that, most restaurants only record 10% revenue. 65% is what they're making. And Capriet made more in 2020 than they did in 2029. This is how they do it. Monopolize, consolidate, and push something that we consistently need and push those prices up. Price fixing effectively done over the last few decades. And they do it to profit off the misery of the working class. But it goes beyond just these corporate entities, these capitalist parasites. It goes to the question of how is this facilitated? Which leads to our boy, Doug Ford. Over the past 30 to 40 years, there's been consecutive governments who have facilitated this. Ford is just continuing that legacy. This has been primarily liberal and conservative governments, but Ford is continuing that legacy. He just does it a lot more blatantly. That's what we saw with Bill 184, a bill that was tabled in March, brought back in July, and now facilitated this crisis. And this can be seen through the makeup of this landlord-tenant board, a tribunal that's been set up to make sure that the working class is pushed out of the city. Those two people on the top of there, Laurie Mathers and Shannon Keegan, these are lawyers who used to work for pro-landlord law firms. Laurie on the left there used to run a website called evictions.ca, guaranteeing landlords that she'd ensure that their tenants would be evicted out. Shannon Keekins works for Cohen Hiley, one of the largest pro-landlord, anti-tenant organizing law firms in the province of Ontario. Now both of them are adjudicators. The two on the bottom there, Craig Joy and Don King. Don King used to be an RCMP officer, have high-level connections with the Conservative government. And they're a reflection of what's been happening in the city over the last few years. What they reflect is the push, not only on the cronyism of the Ford government, but the facilitation of privatization, the facilitation of a neoliberal agenda that we've been seeing throughout the Western world, the facilitation of Ontario being open for business at our expense. But it's not just, housing is not just a provincial matter as much as everybody likes to tell us that. It does go down to the city as well. And I think as we're seeing with these encampments, as we see the tents go up around the city has a vested interest in this too. John Tory has been at the forefront of making the city unlivable for working class people. From defunding our neighborhoods to assisting in the gentrification process, everything from sidewalk labs to the push out of working class people, to the over-policing that our communities see. This city has worked, and its mayors have worked to create a playground for the rich. And what we see, this provincial to city connection, is done through the pictures on the right there. Those are police cars that showed up at an eviction in Crescent Town. There's around a dozen cars and maybe 24 police officers. Sheriffs who facilitate the evictions, who show up at your doorstep, cannot use force. And so that's why they bring in the police. The police are the protectors of private property, as we know, and you need them at the end of the day to finish off the final step of the eviction process. A few months ago in October, there was an Indigenous sister out of Goodwood Park, one of the neighborhoods we organize in. And she was 65, had mental health and physical health issues, and she was going to be evicted out. So the Goodwood Park Tenants Union, alongside ourselves and organizing supporters from across the city, staged a 6-week-long blockade. We stopped the sheriffs from showing up the first day, did a confrontation of it, and maintained the blockade for 6 weeks. The sheriffs start working at 9 o'clock in the morning. And 6 weeks later, to the day that they tried to evict her the first time around, at 8:40, cops showed up. 2 unmarked police vans, around 24 police officers, waiting outside the neighborhood and inside the neighborhood. They shut down elevators, they blocked doors, they turned the cameras that are in the floor itself. and they blocked all stairwells to get this one woman out. The sheriffs didn't have to do the work. That's what the police are there for. Them. And this is what we've been seeing, from the provincial government facilitating, to the landlord-tenant board being the judicial arm of it, to the City of Toronto's need for more privatization and more rich people coming in, to the police ensuring not only do they police our communities, but push us out of it. That's been the COVID eviction crisis. But it's not just about them, it's also about us. And what we've seen over the course of the last year, over the course of the last 11 months, is resistance. We know the COVID crisis has drastically affected working class people. We've lost families, jobs, and we've struggled. But we've also had the ability to see the reality of the situation. The fractures that the Carmets have talked about, the fractures that have always existed, has become so much more clear. In April of 2020, Carmets out of Parkdale Organize made a call out to the rest of the city of an April 1st rent strike. The idea being, we don't know what our future looks like. The biggest expense that all working class people face today is rent. And if we don't know what it looks like, we need to hold our money. And across the city, people took on that call. Organizers, tenants, individuals who were struggling took on that call and organized their neighborhoods. I want to play a clip that quickly covers some of the things that's been happening over the last 11 months, especially in the neighborhoods of Crescenttown and Goodwood Park in East York.
With business closures and layoffs across the country, renters in Toronto are voicing their concerns about making their rent payments, struggling to make ends meet as the COVID-19 outbreak continues.
This tenant, a laid-off factory worker, says even with government help, he can't afford to look after his family and rent.
If you have a choice between putting food on your table or paying rent, you're putting food on your table. People will not be evicted.
And now residents who took part in the Keep Your Rent movement say they have been experiencing harassing behavior at the hands of their landlords.
This COVID is nothing.
Oh my God, don't say that we're losing our family. Our family died.
Yesterday that he wished he had magical powers to stop evictions. There is no need to resort to magic. Mayor Tory has the legal power to ban evictions in Toronto today.
Residents of a long-term care home.
Mr. Friedman, how can you sleep at night knowing that people died because you were cheap?
Bye! Don't come back! Don't come back!
Stay close!
this is what our last 11 months have been looking like. What we've been seeing across the city is the rise of tenant unions. I'd like to take us back to the first few months of the COVID crisis. As folks have pointed out, there's been a lot of discussion about it post, but I remember this first few months of it. People with means run and hid. The social service industry, the poverty pimps, that is the NGOs, were working from home and not entering these neighborhoods. And tenants, working class people, the poor, were left to fend for themselves. And what came out of that is that people did. What we saw in these neighborhoods were mutual aid projects that came directly from the neighborhoods. People taking care of each other with food, with whatever was needed, with PPE, with toilet paper. But we also saw people talking to each other. And from that were built tenants unions. And these tenants unions have been at the forefront of the struggle over the last 11 months. And what we've been seeing with these tenant unions is a willingness to do things that people thought that not only they shouldn't, but they wouldn't do. The two pictures on the left and the right actually happened a few weeks ago. What we've been seeing with these tenant unions is a level of militancy. Because when those first 6 months were happening, it was militant and working class people who were left on the streets. The picture on the left is cockroaches left at the doorstep of Pinedale Properties VP Finance. These are cockroaches directly from the neighborhood. People collected it during a mutual aid campaign that was happening with delivering food. And the next day dropped it off right at his front door on Valentine's Day. The picture on the right is of 5 different neighborhoods across the city, 5 different building blocks owned by Rani Management. And at 9 o'clock at night, people showed up, threw floodlights onto the CEO's front door and his house, a multi-million-dollar mansion, and demanded that he come outside. Militancy. And for us, it's this question of what does militancy look like? Because this is not just to do it for theatrics. This is not about just protesting and calling on those who left us here and pleading with them, the city, the state, the province, those who profit off our misery. This is not about asking them for something. This is about demanding what's ours. For us, militancy, including working class militancy, is about using every tool that we have, any ability that we have, to ensure 2 things: defend our communities and take the fight to them. Those who profited off our misery need to be as terrified as we are. 400,000 people are in arrears in the province of Ontario, and they get to sleep at night. The militancy that we're going to need, the militants that we're seeing, is a militancy that we're going to need moving forward. And what we've been breaking with it is a constant notion of the model minority. What we've been breaking with this is the ability for working class people who've been pushed onto the sidelines, who people did not want to sue and fight back, the ability for them to fight back. Bear with me here.
We're gonna have to wrap up in a second, Sam.
Of course. You know what? I'll skip out on the last little clip where at the landlord-tenant board over the last few weeks, what these tenant unions have been doing is taking over the landlord-tenant board. There's been moments where adjudicators have been kicked out. We've been finding people in the hallways who have been missing their hearings, and we've taken it over to fight in their courts as well. And I say all this because there is something that's about to come. The COVID-19 crisis might be over at some point, and there's constant conversation of going back to normal. On our end, we know that the precarious situation of the working class is going to get worse as every crisis brings forth. But on the other end of it, we're not going back to normal. Historically, as we've seen, from the 1930s to the Black Panther Party to what we're seeing right now, working class people who are willing to keep on fighting, willing to take this fight to the halls and powers that have put them in that situation, that's the only offense and defense that we have. So in our communities, we're about to go to court again and we'll fight there. And if evictions do happen in our communities, the commitment has been the same. We will defend our communities at our door by any means necessary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. in terms of questions, a couple of things. There's one question that of those left still here, it looks like maybe it might be one for Greg, from what I can see, but it's a question from Kathy asking, I would really like to know if any academics are critiquing housing first as a neoliberal policy, and comments on why there are no national or provincial unions that mention housing in their platforms and websites. Oh, sorry, there's more people here than I thought.
Sorry, is a question for me?
Well, it was either two. Actually, my screen didn't show that Simone was here. I thought Simone had left, but either of you.
You go ahead, Greg.
So I'd say that from my observation, by and large, there's very little academic work on this. I just started reading the book that I mentioned, quoted in my piece by Sam Mitchell called Mean Streets. I think there's some critique there of it, and a few dissertations I've read here and there, but by and large, my observation from the Homeless Hub and other locations that by and large the academic world is kind of swallowed it whole. I would say progressive counselors keep kind of touting it and using the phrase chronic homelessness, which I think is really offensive from my perspective. And so, yeah, the answer is there's very little out there. I think it does exist, but it's hard to find. And then there was the question about like unions fighting for housing. I'm really disturbed that they're not. It seems like a fairly straightforward thing, like homes are pretty essential, as I think everybody on the panel has mentioned, and everybody just knows instinctively. And so, yeah, don't really have too much to add to that. But
okay, fair enough. Then I have a general question that I'd like to put, and please just wave and jump in. But this one should take us to the end, I think. And I'd really like to know, I mean, it comes out from everything, all of the presentations in one way or another speak to the fact that the pandemic is a crisis, but it didn't come from nowhere. And the crisis that communities are facing, the ingredients of that crisis was already there before the pandemic ever struck. And so my question is what is the post-pandemic reality going to look like? Like, what is going to be left in the wake of the pandemic when it's finally gone, when there's finally no more infection in this pandemic? When it's gone, when the pandemic is gone, what will your communities face, and how will your communities organize in that situation? Who wants to tackle that first?
I mean,
Annika.
I'll go first. So what will be waiting for a community after the pandemic? There are lots of evictions, the continuous of lack of employment, still working precarious jobs without sick benefits. The same situations that were happening before the pandemic is probably going to be continuing to happen. But one thing our community is using this time to do, and before, is to mobilize. And it is to educate and also inform our residents around different tools that we can use to be able to negotiate on developments that are happening in our community, and also just to create frameworks to help our community to navigate dealing with the city and developers. Because at the end of the day, it's sad, but it's always on the backs of community, of working poor community, to consistently fight for themselves and to also show that they are valuable, and that the work that valuable, that they are working those precarious jobs that many Canadian folks do not want to work. And with that they are essential. They were essential before being called essential. The person who was bagging your grocery was always essential, because if they weren't there to cash you out, because then what would happen? If there wasn't the mothers and fathers working at the senior living homes or whatever, then what would be happening? But it also talks about a time where we should collectively be mobilizing, so that Parkdale is not fighting just the issue in Parkdale. Regent Park is not just fighting an issue in Regent Park, but how we collectively, as communities who are facing these high mass gentrification, are collectively working together. And also where we're gonna pull in different stakeholders that that either they can help mobilize the initiative, or we're gonna bulldoze them out of the way. But I know that we have to definitely be taking a more forceful action. And overall, as I said, we need to leverage organizations and anchor institutions and businesses that are in our community and force them to see that there's value in the community that they're making a profit off of and they're surrounded in. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? What? Yeah, Sam, I think is.
I think our assessment of this is what we're going to walk into is a post-COVID wasteland in working class communities. There's already been a push, as Carmet's saying, of gentrification and a push out that's been happening for years now. On the Danforth Strip, for example, Little Bangladesh, there's been a work in progress for almost 15 years to try to get those small businesses out. Real mom and pop shops that cater to the Bengali community. Their doors are getting closed right now. All those small little restaurants, their doors are getting closed. And what we're going to see is both a monopolization and consolidation of not only the housing industry, but large businesses. There's a reason that Amazon made the millions of dollars, billions of dollars it's did over the last little bit. And for us, the response back is to organize. We should have started years ago, but we need to be doing it right now. And it's not a fight to try to protect what we have. We need to start pushing even further. Our goal in People's Defense and the conversations that we have with tenants constantly is that, like, the neoliberal agenda needs to have a serious blow to it. If the crisis is bad right now, it is going to get worse. We're in the eye of the storm, and it might not feel like it, but it will get worse. Entire industries being completely demolished in the span of days, people losing thousands of jobs in a single day. So if we organize and we start pushing back, that might be the only way that we might survive this. And our neighborhoods are going to become that fortification that we need.
Okay. Thank you so much. Simone, you go.
I think, like, in terms of what we're seeing is that we look at other cities where encampments are entrenched, and we see that there's like a tendency to make sanctioned encampments. You look at San Francisco, look at places where people are shoved into more and more substandard housing. And so we're fending that off all the time in terms of like the city council and the way in which like people are talking about like how to manage the situation. So the fight has to just be for housing all the time. And that's actually like a really difficult thing because people are dying on the street right now. So right now we're embroiled in like a fight around tiny shelters and whether or not people should be able to live in boxes in parks, right? That doesn't feel good, but it is necessary because people do die in the cold if we don't fight for that. And so I think like, that's like always going to be like, I've had tenant organizers come and be like, how can we show solidarity? And the reality is that like a lot of people who are on the street are like in constant chaos, and living in a climate where there is like cold just means that like it hasn't been like 8 months of people being able to organize within communities in a way that is like as comfortable as possible, right? Like a park is never comfortable, but it like it's easier in the summer to have community. So I kind of just want to talk about like, yeah, I don't know what the future holds, but I feel like sharing like things that we've noticed as like challenges to organizing amongst ourselves is really important. Aligned with Art of War, I often feel like I don't want to put it out in the public right now and just like talk about those things because you know, you have to be careful what can be used against you. But I would love to talk to everyone on this panel about how we can align and things like that. Yeah, we're just fighting it like an administration, and it's the same fight. It's against like property development and corrupt politicians. At the end of the day, like we find ourselves sometimes teetering on the edge of trying to do this like weird PR thing where we're fighting for a public that will say that people who are unhoused are like, you know, worthy of housing. Like that is like, how are we here? We have to do that. But like, ultimately the public's opinion doesn't matter. We know there is broad-based support for people living in encampments, and the city administration doesn't care. And I think that's what I want to put forward, that while we're engaged in a kind of truth telling, like we have a ruthless city. It's not about awareness. Like it's not about awareness. It's about corruption. And yeah, anyways, I don't know about the future, but.
Okay. Thanks, Simone. Thanks to everybody. We're unfortunately out of time, but really incredibly important discussion. I think it made an enormous contribution, not just to a panel series, it made a contribution to realizing that we're actually, the situation is grim, but we're seeing people organizing, we're seeing initiatives, we're seeing people fighting back, and they're not going to get it all their own way, by a long way. Next time we'll be focusing on workers' struggles. It will deal with a bit of an overview of the situation in the United States. It will deal with the struggle around low-wage precarious work in Ontario, and it will deal with migrant workers and the struggles that they face in the midst of the pandemic. So thank you so much to all the members of the panel, and thanks to everybody that participated in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.